Welcome to Eviliv, the live media commentary show that answers the question, do you have to kill someone to get into the Hells Angels? Subscribe if you're new to the channel because today we are reviewing Hells Angels, the strange and terrible saga of the outlaw motorcycle gangs. Now, the book touches on a couple of different gangs throughout the course of it, but really the main focus, of course, is on the Hells Angels. And what this can actually be seen as is almost a historical retrospective on how the Hells Angels got started and when they started to believe their own hype and what that actually meant in the time. Now, this in March 1965, The Nation editor Carrie McWilliams wrote to Hunter S. Thompson and offered to pay him for an article on the subject of motorcycle gangs and the Hells Angels in particular. The Hells Angels began just as an article titled The Motorcycle Gangs, Losers and Outsiders, written by Thompson for the May 17th, 1965 issue of The Nation. The article published about a month later, and it prompted book offers from several publishers interested in the topic. I'd fall into the same trap. I'm not sure what exactly draws us to this sort of outlaw lifestyle of motorcycle gangs. I assume it's the same that would draw one to Viking raiders, in a different era, or gunslingers in the 18th century. So, or 19th century. I assume it's that sort of vibe of wanting to just not have to obey any rules and do whatever you want, whenever you want to do it type mentality. And that sort of individualism. And I get that. Like, I'm drawn to it as well. I, on the other hand, don't fall in line with some of the ideas that the Hells Angels ultimately espouse. And I thought this was an interesting look at the lifestyle and personalities of the Hells Angels, specifically the Oakland and San Francisco chapters. So that's where this really focuses on. Hunter S. Thompson spent the next year preparing for this book in close quarters with the Hells Angels, in particular the San Francisco and Oakland chapters of the club and their president, Ralph Sonny Barger. Now, ultimately, his and the Hells Angels relationship waned after that year, ended for good after several members of the gang gave him a savage beating or stomping over a remark that Hunter S. Thompson made to one of the Angels named Junkie George, who was beating his wife. Hunter S. Thompson said, "Only a punk beats his wife and dog." And that just flipped a switch in his head, and Sonny started beating the shit. Junkie George started beating the shit out of Hunter S. Thompson, who then summarily cried out to some of the other gang members to help him. And one of them did. And I'm trying to remember just off the top of my head. I just finished this, so I should remember. I think it was Tiny who ended up pulling him out, telling everyone else to calm down and throwing him out of the club so that Hunter just jumped in his car and just drove away to the hospital because he was so worried about it. Ultimately being killed is what he was really worried about. So the book, after being written, was published on September 29th, 1996 by Ballantine Books. Originally, it was Hunter S. Thompson's first published book, and it was his first attempt at nonfiction novel. Hells Angels was the book that launched his career as a writer, and ultimately, he was seen as a journalist before that. This book forced him into the view of a writer. Now, I was first introduced to Hunter S. Thompson, of course, through Johnny Depp's portrayal of him in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the film adaptation of the huge cultural hit novel. That was released, of course, after this, I believe. And I still have yet to read the novel, shockingly enough. It is definitely on my list. I'm not going to read it next because I already got that one penned, but it'll be the one after that. And I've always loved the idea of Hunter S. Thompson less than the actual individual, Hunter S. Thompson. Of course, he coined the phrase Gonzo journalism, which is really just journalism through his filter of a perspective. So it's a completely different view of reality and facts, influenced solely by his consciousness and his state of mind at that moment, which is, it can be interesting. It's certainly with Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, it was very interesting. Of course, Hunter S. Thompson was an addict. He was a gun enthusiast, a motorcycle enthusiast, though he didn't ride his motorcycle much in the end because, again, drugs and alcohol took over everything. There's this wonderful documentary on his life. I think it's on Amazon Prime right now, and it's worth looking if you are interested in him as an author, as a character, or as his works, because it gives you a really nice overview of his career and his life after he ultimately stopped writing and in the end of his life. So he is a very interesting character. Now, this is seen as an up-close and uncompromising look at the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club during the time when the gang was highly feared and accused of numerous criminal activities. What I came into this novel looking for was a Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas style view of the Hells Angels, filtered directly through, that sort of Gonzo journalism perspective. But this was before that was really fully developed. And because this was his first novel, this is really just a random factual look at the Hells Angels and some other motorcycle gangs and the sort of interplay between the two. It is non-linear, meaning it jumps around through the history and stories as told by some of the gang members themselves. I say gang because it is really a motorcycle gang. It's not a motorcycle club. But what I got from this ultimately was not only, the history. I mean, it was the number one motorcycle gang, the Hells Angels, the emblem of winged skulls wearing motorcycle helmet and MC below over the Hells Angels type. And below that, they would have their chapter name and colors. That's sort of the look that you're seeing on the jacket there. That's the emblem of the Hells Angels. It was started in 1950 in Southern California by San Bernardino or Berdoo chapter. And of course, it's all veterans. And so 1950, you're looking at Korean War, you're looking at World War II vets, you're going to be rolling into Vietnam, ultimately with the time that this book takes place primarily. But it is interesting to think of how far back the Hells Angels actually go, what it was like when it started, and what it actually ended up being. These are kids. These are 20-year-old kids. They're half my age younger than I am. That's insane to think about when you think about an outlaw motorcycle gang. And it also explains why they acted the way they did. Because they're kids. They're not grown-ups. It's funny because I can't help, compare and contrast the difference between this factual journey of the Hells Angels versus a dramatized serial like Sons of Anarchy. The two would have fought, and the Hells Angels would have beat the shit out of that motorcycle club because they are absolute pussies compared to the Hells Angels that are depicted in this novel. Another thing I thought was really interesting about the Hells Angels is that they got blamed for infinitely more than they actually did. So their reputation was infinitely worse than the realities of the individuals in the club. And that's not to say that those individuals weren't horrible, because they were, and they did horrible fucking things. I mean, raping, physically brutalizing men and women and families. There's a guy literally named Child Molester as his Charger Charlie the Child Molester as his name. I mean, these were bad human beings by all societal accounts. They just went to the beat of their own drum and did whatever the hell they felt like. They're a little bit more like wild animals than they were actual members of a society, even though many of them were married and did live in homes they owned. They had regular jobs, and then they would do the motorcycle thing after hours and on weekends and whenever there was a get together and stuff. So what ended up happening was there was this, and I don't think this is the first real travesty that the Hells Angels were penned on, for, but it was the one that caught the most national attention and really drove the Hells Angels' reputation into notoriety and sort of infamy, as it were. It was a 14 and 15-year-old girl that were raped. The 15-year-old girl was pregnant, and they were taken to a beach, and they were raped repeatedly by many of the gang members. And then later the police would have picked them up and, taken their testimony and actually charged a number of the motorcycle gang members, threw them in jail, the case was actually thrown out. No one of the Hells Angels was convicted simply because the girls lied by and large about the rape. Not that they didn't have sex, they did, but the girls wanted to have sex with a number of them, and then they were upset at the end or in the middle of it, and then they sort of reported it. At no point during the course of the engagement did they tell them to stop or to prevent the act from occurring any further. And again, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not rape. That just means that by the technical definition of the time, the case had to be dropped because the girls lied. And, you just can't have a case to convict a bunch of people who did not, one, even have sex with them, and two, it was consensual at the time. And so you can't charge someone for rape when the person was into it at the time. So it is really interesting to see why a case that was thrown out of court ended up being the case that made the Hells Angels infamous all over continental U.S., arguably, North America and the world. And what you ended up seeing out of all this notoriety was increased police tamp down on motorcycle activities, increased jailings, increased actual police would run them off the road and in some cases murder them just to get them out of their town or, because they just thought they were going to go around raping their wives and children. So that notoriety ended up being very dangerous for some of these bikers. Ultimately, these bikers started to believe their own hype. And that led them to then behave even more egregiously because, as they saw it, that's what the public expected of them. And they were just starting to live up to public expectation. And there's a little bit of irony baked into that premise. Because at one hand, or at one point, the motorcycle gang doesn't give a damn about society, and they're just doing what they want to do, living the life they want to live. And then they get attention, and they start feeding into that attention, creating this feedback loop that they're getting off on. And so they're starting to like getting into politics. And the Hells Angels ended up getting into political issues and commenting in the press and having news conferences. And I mean, it got to be this sort of insane echo chamber of we're horrible, so we need to show you how horrible we are, but we're really not that horrible, and you shouldn't believe all the hype, and, let us tell you what we think about politics. And it became this really insane situation. Meanwhile, individual Hells Angels are still committing all of the atrocities that they're always committing and getting away with. And very few of them end up getting convicted, though many of them spend a lot of time in jail for the terrible things that they're blamed for. It's a very strange experience reading this because, again, all of my expectations were not met. I wanted them to be their hype. No, they tried to live up to their hype, and though some of them, were pretty stunning and disgusting, it was more hype. And so you start to think, how can I respect or admire this sort of motorcycle gang when they're not even what they purport to be? That's the view I got of them from reading this. Now, again, I don't know any Hells Angels, and maybe they are in fact true to the myths, but according to this, they are absolutely not. They're bad, but they're not as bad as people say they are. There's rumors about why it's called Hells Angels. Part of it was that it was named after World War I bomber or the Army Corps. Ultimately, in 1965, the Oakland chapter took over the face of the Hells Angels from the San Bernardino chapter. And that's really, with Sonny Barger, it becomes something really, truly grand. And that's when they're getting all the popularity and the attention in the late 60s that they got, ultimately. I'm trying to look through my notes here and see if anything sort of stands out. I mean, it was in 1964, the Monterey Beach situation where the 14 and 15-year-old were raped repeatedly, but the charges ended up being dropped. let's see, they saw films like The Wild One, and they sort of tried to emulate sort of the Marlon Brando feel, even though he wasn't as tough as they purported themselves to be or believed themselves to be. They wouldn't do things like wear helmets or leather. First of all, it was California, and so the heat would have been horrible to wear leather, but also they enjoyed the idea of being in a dangerous situation on the back of their incredibly powerful choppers. That thrilled them. And that's why you would have them binge drinking and doing drugs and committing sexual acts. They're just sort of crazy and wild. There's story after story of them holding down women against their will, ripping out a tampon, and then just doing, committing or engaging the act of cunnilingus on them to get their red wings or maybe just to shock them. Some of the Hells Angels would regularly make out with each other, two guys, just to showcase not only their connection with brotherhood with each other, but also to freak out people watching. And they claim it wasn't homosexual at all, but they definitely did it, frequently in front of strange people or strangers to them just to get a reaction out of them. They have this code where there is no one-on-one fighting. If anyone, for any reason, hits a Hell's Angel, every Hell's Angel in that area immediately has to jump in and pummel the person who hit the Hell's Angel, regardless of whether there was a right or wrong. No matter what, it's written into the bylaws. You have to jump in and beat the shit and ostensibly do everything but overtly murder the person. And because of the era, they got away with a lot because, some of the physical atrocities they committed were against minorities. Some of them were against rival gangs. And so cops would turn a blind eye. They're like, oh, well, that was just a black guy, so we don't really care. Or that was just another gang violence. We're just going to let them, take care of each other. And then, one of them will be one less nuisance we have to worry about. And that's really the perception that the cops had at that time, which is shocking, even though nowadays the cops would just murder everyone and, call it a day. Back then, cops actually did their job as peacemakers, even though they went above and beyond what they should have done. It was very, very interesting. Hey, Chris. Let's see. There were a ton of Hells Angels by you where you grew up, and there are none anymore. Yeah, that's interesting. It didn't talk about any East Coast Hells Angels. This is all in the California area, the beginnings of the motorcycle gang itself, and then how it came to notoriety. Again, it was written, back in, 1965 or something when it was originally released. So, 1966. So this is way before anything nowadays. So maybe they completely changed. Maybe they're a little bit more crazy or maybe a little more straight or whatever, but it's definitely a different beast nowadays than it was back in the day. It was talking about how there was a whole motorcycle chapters of the Hells Angels that would just go on these massive acid binges, taking way more than the prescribed dose at the time and just losing their minds daily because they were just bored. And so they needed something to sort of take that boredom. It talked about their lifestyle with their women, where there's different types of women, and all the groupie hang-on women were just outright abused in really terrible, terrible fashion. But you can't, the way I see it is if the person's willing, then it's their fault. They're the ones walking into the club and saying, hey, I want to hang out here and be a groupie. And then they just get physically and sexually assaulted and tossed around amongst the men, multiple gang rapes. But they stay. They just hang out. And you could argue this, large conversation about history of violence in society and stuff, but I don't know anything about these women other than they did stay and they engaged in these activities on a repeated basis. So I can only judge based on their actions, not on how they were raised and, how that might have contributed to how they ended up. But it's a pretty big culture shift from how things are handled nowadays to how they were handled back then with all these crimes. And ultimately, I walked away from this just thinking, I'm not really that impressed with this motorcycle club. They're kids in their 20s. They're not adults. They ultimately grew older, but in the height when this was happening, the vast majority of them were in their 20s. They're just literally ignorant or stupid, and just not impressed with the behavior. And here's the reality. Look, the way I see this is, I like the idea of fierce independence, living life by the beat of your own drum, and not worrying and caring about anyone else. But the second you start accepting the benefits of the society that you're living in, then you're part of that society. And it's incumbent upon you to act like you're a part of that society. Now, the Hells Angels did ultimately, sort of steer in directions where they would try to reform their image. They would help people on the side of the road fix their cars without being asked. They would escort people safely. They would, guard rock concerts and stuff and prevent the musicians from being hurt. I mean, they did engage in activities that were beneficial to the society at large, but it was few and far between, and it was never enough to reform what society wanted the Hells Angels to actually be versus how they actually behaved amongst their own. And the truth is they were not dangerous. I mean, yes, if you stepped up to them and overtly smacked one of them, then yeah, it's going to be dangerous. But if you're just living your life, they don't give a damn about you, and they're not going to go out of their way to hurt you. I mean, not all cases are the same, and there could be just a random Hells Angel that just gets angry for whatever reason and reacts. But there's store owners, there's a bunch of stores in here where it's like a gas station attendant or owner saw a whole bunch of Harleys coming in, and they were like, "Hey, we need to use your garage to fix some of our Harleys. Is that okay?" He's like, "I'm leaving, you take care of everything." And they just walked away because they didn't want to be murdered by this group of Hells Angels. And then they'd come back when they got the nerve to come back to their shop, and they found that it was completely cleaned, that there was money on the counter for anything that they took, and they actually took care of this attendant. So for every horrendous story that the Hells Angels have about them, there are an equal amount of just endearing stories that these people are actually decent folks, even though they're horrible. How crazy is that to sort of justify in your head? But it's all based on personal experience as far as perception. My drill sergeant used to say perception is 9/10 of reality. So your personal experience is going to inform infinitely more your opinion than, say, a news headline or a news anchor reporting, frivolous stories that you never follow up to see if they actually panned out to be real or not. And that's the mystique that the Hells Angels, for better or worse, lived under. It was very, very strange. So let's see, anything else? All the homosexual claims were based on Kenneth Anger's film and behavior. But Kenneth Anger is, he was a friend of Anton LaVey's. He's a filmmaker. He did a bunch of homosexual films. He did straight films as well. And all of them were sort of B film. I'm not a historian on Kenneth Anger, so, if I'm speaking out of school, let me know. But he was a sort of counterculture filmmaker of the time, sort of avant-garde filmmaker. And there was a motorcycle film that he made about homosexual bikers. And so the public really started seeing the Hells Angels like that, especially when they would just sit there and make out with each other in front of strangers. But the Hells Angels, again, repeatedly said, "No, we are not gay. This is just us doing it for shock value and, showing affection to each other in a brotherly way." Okay. All right. Whatever you need to sleep at night. So ultimately, after all of my mystique is stripped away through this novel about the Hells Angels, I came to the conclusion that I'm not impressed. I would never want to be a member of this gang like I wanted to as a youth. And I gave this out of 5, 3 evil eyes. The truth is the same thing that I said at the very beginning of this. Hunter S. Thompson is an interesting writer, not particularly great, but he has a very interesting style. I wanted this book to be the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas Hunter S. Thompson, And that's not what this is. I wanted the Hells Angels to be the incredible badasses that they are portrayed to be in the media. That's not what they are. And while Hunter S. Thompson got a vicious beatdown, and the motorcycle gang made a lot of claims against this book, I mean, the reality speaks volumes when you see their actions and how they behave and how they're not monstrous people all the time, but they do engage in monstrous activity some of the time. And really, it just comes down to a bunch of kids, at the time this was written, trying to be tough guys, succeeding in some cases and failing in other cases, and trying to live up to the reputation that others pinned on them, rather than just paying attention to their own lives. And that's kind of sad. It almost makes you feel sorry for them, because they started drinking their own Kool-Aid, and you can never live up to a hype that you don't actually represent. And why would you want to be? It's just, that, again, this independent group of bikers who turned into fame chasers. Okay, you're as bad as you want to be. But that's just my opinion. I'd be interested to hear all of yours. If you've read this, let me know in the comments below. Do you like Hunter S. Thompson as an author? Do you like the Hells Angels as a motorcycle gang? Do you like the idea of just a group of individuals forsaking all societal rules and laws and a stigma and just going on the open road and living by the beat of their own drum? Let me know in the comments. I hope you guys have a fantastic day. And as always, remember that evil spelled backwards is live. So get out there and be evil.